So today we're going to be talking about the Walter G. Curtis family in Smithville, Southport, and beyond. So I think you'll find this an interesting talk, because this was an interesting family, a very private family, I found as I was doing the research for this. So it's been a challenge to dig up the dirt, so to speak, on the Curtis family. And let's move to the next. This is the only photograph that we have that I've ever seen that I could find of Dr. Walter G. Curtis. And as you can see, he was quite elderly by this time. And this is from a portrait that or a photograph of him that hangs in the Masonic Lodge. And it's been given to us at the Historical Society for use by those folks. So it's a good thing, because it's the only photograph that I have found anywhere of him. So let's move along. Next, we're going to talk about this man, Dr. Walter Gilman Curtis. And when I looked at the dates of his life, when he was born in 1826 and died in 1909, it clicked with me that this was about the time of the Victorian era, which of course means the time that Queen Victoria reigned, and that was for over 60 years or whatever it was. But I did put that little graphic on there so you can see the Victorian period for her reign, 1830 to 1901. Well, Walter was born in 1826, 4 years before that, and he died in 1909, 8 years after Queen Victoria died. So we'll just make him a Victorian man. And as we go through the talk today, you'll see more and more about how he conducted and comported himself during that time period. Of course, you know that many of our mannerisms and manners and things that are the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do come from our mother country, England, and especially during this time, which was a building up time and a putting together of our society time in the 1800s, right up to the turn of the century. So let's think about Walter Gilman Curtis. He was the son of Nathanael and Lydia Fowler Curtis, and he was born in Hopkinton, and that's a little bit hard to say, Hopkinton, New Hampshire, in 1826. His father, Nathanael, was a businessman, a merchant probably, and he also represented his area, his town, at the state, as a state legislator in New Hampshire. They lived just a few miles outside of Concord, New Hampshire, which is the capital. And even though they were more or less a rural family, they still had a lot of connections with the city. So after he grew up, had a good education there in Hopkinton, he went away to college. He entered Dartmouth College, which is in New Hampshire, at age 16, and he began his study of medicine at age 18. Now, when he went to the college, he only stayed for 3 terms. So he did not really finish at Dartmouth. And as was the custom at that time, if you were going to study medicine, you basically did that as an apprentice with another doctor, with a more experienced and older doctor. So that's what he did there. He also, after he had been with this doctor in New Hampshire for a couple of years, he did study 1 term of medicine at Harvard, but he did not graduate Harvard as a doctor. And as was the custom at that time, you could just begin practicing as a doctor even without the official MD after your name. And that's what he did. He began practicing at age 21. Now, how did he get down to North Carolina from New Hampshire? And that story is around his sister, Margaret, who was a couple of years younger than he was, and she got a tutoring job in Virginia. And he decided he would come with her, even though he had not secured a job as a tutor. He wanted to leave New Hampshire for some reason, I guess, whatever, it's time to move on.com or whatever, that he decided to come with his sister Margaret. And he tells about the arduous train ride that they had from New Hampshire to get all the way down to Virginia and eventually to North Carolina. Somehow or another, he heard about a doctor here in this little town of Smithville who was thinking about retiring and was looking for someone to take over his practice. So he came to Smithville, and he began apprenticing or working with Dr. Everett, Dr. Sterling Everett, who was a Smithville native and who had been practicing medicine here in Smithville for over 4 decades. So Dr. Everett was the premier doctor in Smithville at that time. So here comes this young man, Walter Curtis, a new doctor in town, and he began to work with Dr. Everett. He also was, he arrived here in 1847. And we'll drop on down, we'll cover more of this in a few minutes, but he spent his medical career here in Smithville. He was the federal quarantine physician, and that was basically his job, along with doing some doctoring, regular doctoring, but not as much. He didn't have the sort of practice that we normally think of for a doctor, because his main thrust in his practice was taking care of the quarantine, and we'll talk about that a little more as well. But he was also a distinguished civil servant in that he had a lot of things going on here in the town that he was involved in. So some say that Dr. Curtis's focus seemed to be more on his civic service than it did on his medical career. But there were other doctors throughout the 60 years that he was here to take care of the population. So he was here for 60 plus years, and never went back to New Hampshire, and just made his life here in Smithville at that time. All of you probably are aware now that we are a town with 2 names. We started out with Smithville 1792 when the town was chartered, and then the name was changed in 1887 to Southport. Okay, Liz, let's see what's next. Here we're going to see some census records. You can go online and get census, actual views of census that were taken from, I think the first one that was taken in our country was 1790, if I'm thinking correctly. But anyway, this will tell us a little bit about Dr. Curtis's 3 wives. Aha! So, the first wife, the first marriage was 1855, and his third marriage was 1878, which we'll hear a little more about. I know you cannot read probably these names and entries on the census, but just to give you kind of an idea, how do you find out these sort of things about people if you don't really know? Well, a census is a good place to go. The top one there was the 1860 census, and that shows that he was married to Sarah C. It shows first that Walter G. Curtis was 34 years old, and that he was a physician, and that he was married to Sarah C. And she is listed there as a keeper of the house, a housekeeper. And no, I take that back. There's no entry there for what her occupation was. That'll come later. So it's just like the census taker going around house to house and talking to whoever comes to the door and says, who lives in this house? How old are they? And where were they born, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, we have Walter G. Curtis, physician. We have Sarah C. That's how she was identified here. And her name was Sarah Copeland Pratt. Her last maiden name was Pratt. And they were married in 1855. She was from Brewster, Massachusetts. She was a daughter of a reverend, a minister there. And so evidently they met somehow up north. And she came here. I think that when I said earlier that he didn't go back to Rhode Island or up north, I actually meant to work or to be, except for one exception. So he visited there, I'm sure. Anyway, this gal got down here with him. She was 27 years old at the time of this census was taken. Now, also underneath her name are a couple of more names who were living in the household at that time. And one of them, of course, as you may or may not be able to see, was Nathanael Curtis. And he was 70 years old, and he was listed as a farmer. Now, this was Dr. Curtis's father from up in Hopkinton, New Hampshire. And this was in the 1860 census. I was able to find out that Dr. Curtis's mother died in 1858. So I'm surmising here that Nathanael came down here to live with his son and his son's wife in Smithville because he was here for the census in 1860 at 70 years of age. And this would have been a couple of years after his wife had died. The fourth person in the list for the household here is Frederick Pratt. Now, he was 24 years old, and he is listed as a merchant. So he had a business, and also you will see over in the next line there, they were supposed to put if they had any wealth or what their income or whatever would be. And he looks like he was pretty wealthy fella. I think there's $3,000 if I'm reading it that right there. But anyway, so that tells us a little bit more about what was going on here, that Freddie had come down to live with his sister and her husband, the doctor, in Smithville, at least in 1860. And that's all I was able to find out about Fred. So don't know what happened to him after this. So that's the first wife. Let me see if I covered everything there. Yeah, they had no children, by the way. So there are no babies or little ones who are listed here, at least at that time. And they had been married for 5 years when this census was taken. So let's look at the second wife, the 1870 census. Here we see his wife is Sarah Twining, and also had a last name of Weeks. Again, a daughter of a minister, Enoch and Eliza Weeks. One source that I found said that she was from Smithville, but I cannot find any information other than that she was Dr. Curtis's wife and that she was the daughter of the Weeks in any of our chronicles or any of our history that we have available to us. And the people who have written about the Curtis family over the years give no more information about her than this. So they were married in, let's see here, They were married in 1866, so after the Civil War. This is the 1870 census we're looking at in the middle. He was 40 years old when they married, and she was 30 years old when they married in 1866. There are two other people listed under in the household at that time, and one of them is Elizabeth Davis, and she is 16 years old, and she is listed as domestic help. There's also an indication there that she was a Black woman. And then just under her name is a Black child, 10 years old, whose name was Bina Westcott, and also D.O., which probably means domestic. So it looks like there was a little help in the house here for the second Sarah, by the way, second wife, same name as the first, Sarah. And it makes it easy to remember, I guess. Anyway, that was the second wife. Third wife, we're looking at in 1880 census, so another 10 years has gone by, and Dr. Curtis has another wife. This one is listed as MJ, and she is 30 years old in this census, and Walter is 54 years old at this time, and they have a baby, CW, just given the initials here. So it looks like this census taker didn't bother with too much with names, mostly initials. And the baby is 5 months old, and that's their first child, Clarence, which we'll hear more about. Margaret Johnson Coit was her full name, and she was the daughter of Dr. Benjamin Coit, and he was a 49er. He left New England and went out to California to get some gold in 1849 and made his life out west. So thought that was interesting, first that he was a doctor, and also that he was a 49er. There is some reference to the fact that Margaret, oh, by the way, they were from New York, actually from metropolitan New York, so she was a city girl, a New Yorker, and there is some indication that he may have known her previously, Dr. Curtis may have known her previously, because there's a couple of references that say that she was a bridesmaid at one of the other weddings, and it must have been the first one, because if Sarah Twining in the middle was from Southport, or from Smithville. So you see how the web we weave when we start trying to figure out all these folks. But anyway, they were married in 1878, and they did have children. There were no children, by the way, with the second wife, Sarah. So up to this point, until he marries Margaret, he has no children. And then he has 3, which we will certainly hear about. Okay, so they were married on May the 9th, 1878, actually one day before his 52nd birthday. His birthday is May the 10th, and she was 35 years old, and he turned 52 the day after the wedding. All right, let's look at some tombstones next. Now we're going to see about these dead wives and where they are. These are 3 tombstones that are right here in Southport, down at the old Smithville burying ground. These are the first 2 wives and his father. And underneath each of the tombstones is the inscription that is on the tombstone. The first one, in the memory of Sarah C., the wife of Dr. Walter G. Curtis. She died on January 31st, 1861, and she was 28 years old. And the inspirational inscription was, he giveth his beloved sleep. So this tells us a little bit more about Sarah when she was born, And not really, no, well, yeah, because of her age, we could figure out when she was born, but that she died on January 31st, 1861, and this was just about the time that the Civil War was starting. So this was a difficult time, I'm sure, for Dr. Curtis. And he had come to, remember, he had come here to Smithville in 1847, so he had been here about 13, 14 years by this time, if I'm figuring it right. If I'm not, you figure it right. Okay, now the second one was Sarah Twining, and that she was wife of Dr. Walter G. Curtis. That she was born February 25th, 1836, and died on Christmas Day on December the 25th, 1875, and the inscription was, "The Lord hath giveth and hath taken away." So the third tombstone that we have here in our cemetery is his father, Nathanael Curtis, and he died on March the 14th, 1870, and he was 83 years old, and faithful unto death. So Nathanael stayed here about 10 years because if you remember, we had him on the 1860 census, and he died in 1870. So he was here with his son and wife, or no wife, for a good 10 years, making his home here in Smithville. The census in 1860 listed him as a farmer. I do not think that he had a big farm anywhere or whatever. Maybe he just kept the garden in the backyard going and got the indication that he was a farmer. I guess you have to put something on the record. Okay, so now we have Dr. Curtis at this time. He's lost two wives. It's 18 up to 1875. But let's find out a little bit more about him as we look at the war years coming up next. So the war years, we usually think of those 4 years, 1861 to 65, at which time our country was involved in the Civil War. And according what he was doing at that time was attending to the business of doctoring in Smithville, taking care of people. And he was unmarried at this time because, remember, his first wife had died in 1861, in January of 1861. And he did not remarry until 1866. He was also given an assignment during these years to be the doctor at the fort for the soldiers, whoever happened to be at the fort at that time, as well as continuing his work here among the general population in the town at that time. So he did not march off to war at this time, but his work was here, taking care of the sick, wounded, and dying. At this time, during the Civil War, there was a huge yellow fever epidemic in Wilmington, and this was in 1862, right in the middle of the years of the war, and many people contracted yellow fever. First thought they had was escape, run. Where do you run to from Wilmington? Run to Smithville. Get on a boat and go down the river and be away from the city and from all of the things that were going on there as far as the illness being spread around. So the yellow fever was a big deal, and many of the people who came here, some of our sources say that every house was full in Smithville. So many people came into the town, took every place there was a spare room, a spare bed, in order to get away from this epidemic in Wilmington. And if you can read the inscription on that plaque, that is out at the Oakdale Cemetery where a mass grave, basically, for so many of the yellow fever victims were buried there. So that was what was happening. And there was a very sad story here in Smithville based on the yellow fever that came at that time in 1862. We'll see there's tombstones in this next picture. So yes, there were some yellow fever deaths here in Smithville, but not as many as there was in Wilmington. So the town here was blessed not to be completely overwhelmed, even though so many people from Wilmington did come, and it was spread. By the way, the yellow fever came in on a ship from a foreign port, and that's how it got started. That's one of the dangers of living in port cities, especially at that time, was the disease that could come in on these ships. Let's look at, this is actually one tombstone. You're seeing the front over on your left-hand side, and you're seeing the back of this stone on the right-hand side. You can almost piece together the cracks in it when you look at it this way. But this was one tombstone commemorating 5 people who all died of the yellow fever here in October in the fall of 1862. And they were Smithville residents. They were of the population here. The first one over on your left is saying this is sacred to the memory of Caroline E., who was the wife of Philip Priolu, and her 2 sons, Thomas, who was 12, and John, who was 11. They all died at Smithville of yellow fever in the fall of 1862. All of that is written on the tombstone. Now, Caroline E. was the daughter of a very prominent citizen, Mr. John Brown. This stone is in our cemetery, in the center where the big wrought iron fence goes all around in a big square. We call this the center point of our cemetery, the old burying ground there. And those that family, the Brown family, are the ones who are there. So Caroline was a Brown. She was Caroline Brown, and the daughter of John Brown and his wife, I think her name was Eliza, or whatever. Anyway, she and her 2 sons, so John Brown's daughter and 2 grandsons died of yellow fever. On the back side of this same tombstone, we have these words: in memory of Robert W. Brown, who was born at Smithville, North Carolina, in November of 1828, and he died in Nassau, September the 29th, 1862, 34 years old. I think I'm right in saying that he was a, oh, help me.
Is he a river pilot? I mean,
yep, not the river pilot.
Blockade runner.
Yeah, blockade runner. Yeah, that term just would not come to me. But anyway, yes, I think that Robert was a blockade runner, or else he was one who was moving supplies back and forth during the Civil War here. So it's a memorial to him because he's not buried there. He's buried in Nassau, and also a memorial to his wife, Caroline Marie, who was born April the 11th, 1833, died in Smithville, October 21st, 1862, 29 years old, and she died of the yellow fever as well. So that was his wife. Of course, Robert Brown was the son of John Brown and the brother of Caroline, who's on the other side of the tombstone, and the uncle to the 2 little boys who died. So we're thinking now about this Brown family. They've lost their son, Robert, in Nassau. His wife died as well here in Smithville. Their daughter, Caroline, who was married to Priolu at this time, and their 2 grandsons. This was not tragic enough, because even though we don't have her tombstone in the cemetery, their daughter, Susan Brown Rankin, also died at the same time of the yellow fever. So they lost a son, a daughter, a daughter-in-law, two daughters, Caroline and Susan, their son Robert, their daughter-in-law Caroline, two grandsons, all at the same time here. And the patriarch, the father of the family, John Brown, also contracted yellow fever, but he survived, as did his wife. But they went through all of this tragedy in that just a matter of a couple of months when this yellow fever came through. So it was very, very sad time for the Brown family. Just as an example of what was going on, along with a war that was going on all over the country dealing with this. So I'm sure that Dr. Curtis was attentive to these people, especially these whom he knew, I'm sure, because in other references we do find that Philip Prialu, the husband and father of those who died, was a good friend of Dr. Curtis's. He mentions him several times in some of his writings. So let's see if we can talk about something a little more cheerful here. Let's go to the next picture. And we see here, I'm going to take you around to a few of the buildings and other things in this town at this time that had a connection with Dr. Curtis. And one of these was the Smithville Academy. And also this was the Pythagoras Masonic Lodge, and it was established in 1852. Dr. Curtis wrote a book. I didn't make a slide of it, and I don't know if you can see it, but it's a little book here. And in this book, he does some remembering about what he wrote this at the end of his life in 1905. But he is remembering 50 years between 1850 and 1900 in this little book. And one of the passages in this is interesting about education and schooling here in North Carolina, in the South, and particularly here in Smithville at this time. And he says, neither history nor tradition records that any attention of consequence was paid to education or public schools previous to 1815. There was a tradition of roving schoolmasters from the old country who traveled about teaching schools here and there as they could find enough pupils to give them support. These men would teach a short while in a place and then move on to some other field. Some of them were dilapidated gentlemen who passed as graduates of Oxford or Cambridge, but none of them seemed to be of much value to the cause of education. But about the year 1850, Mr. Jeremiah Murphy moved to Smithville for the purpose of establishing a school. Mr. Murphy was a very agreeable gentleman, reliable, and a man of fine character and abilities. He was a scholar and a gentleman of varied talents. He was well known to the writer, Dr. Curtis, as a genial companion and a good friend. And he, with some other friends, took on an active interest in promoting and teaching students here in Smithville. So they made an agreement with some of the men here in town to build a school. And this is it, the Smithville Academy that was established around 1852. Then Mr. Murphy and another teacher began teaching classes, teaching boys in this school in 1852. The building was financed by donations, and most notably by the St. John's Masonic Lodge, gave quite a bit of money to help build this building, with the stipulation that the upper floor, the second story, would always be the lodge, would always be set aside for the use by the Masons. So the downstairs was the school, was the academy. Upstairs was always set aside as only to be used by the Masons at this time. Now, the little insert up at the top shows you what this building looks like today. And it's almost hard to believe, but that's the Masonic Lodge that sits in front of our post office here in Southport. And that's its regeneration after these, many years later. And the porch was added, the columns were added, so it extended itself. And you see the tree in front of the old picture? The same tree is still there today. It's just a different angle that I made the shot from. But if you study that, you could figure out exactly the position of the building. But it's the same, the bones of the same building that's been added to and taken away from all of these years. But this was important to Dr. Curtis, that there be good education, because he was a refined man, and he thought it important in this town to have good schooling, even if it was only for the boys. Okay, but there was Kate Stewart and others who helped educate the girls, but we can't talk about that now. Another story. Okay, our next photo, we will see Maggie and the three darling boys enter his life. This is Margaret Johnson Coit, Johnson Coit, yeah. And they were married May the 9th. I told you about that earlier, when he was 52 and she was 35. And they had actually 4 children. Their baby girl, Margaret, died in infancy, but they had Walter Clarence, who was born in 1879, Nathanael Cortlandt, and the T on the end of that is right because that was an old family name in her family, born in 1881, and Howard Coit, Coit being her maiden name, born in 1882. Now, I said earlier that it was almost impossible to find pictures of these people, and it was. So I just went to the internet and found some people that I thought looked like them. So just for fun, I found some Victorian age boys, and lo and behold, there were 3 of them together in a picture who were stair steps, just like these boys were. And then I found this mother and child that I thought was very wistfully looking like she could be Margaret Coit Curtis. So a little trickery there for you. You know, sometimes if you go to flea markets or antique sales and that sort of things, they have a box full of old photographs. It said if you don't have any ancestors, pick out some. And so that's basically what I did here. So hopefully none of the Curtis family that's still living is going to be offended if they ever see this, which they probably won't. But here's Maggie. Margaret was called Maggie, and she's 35 years old when she marries Dr. Curtis and comes from New York down here to live in the backwater of North Carolina. And she was not at all happy about living here. She did not like Smithville at all. She was not happy without her social amenities and things that she was used to, but she was married to a doctor, and she was 35 years old, so I guess maybe that was the reason she took it all in anyway. So she was here, and we know that she did not like it here, even though we don't have any pictures of her, because she left us a diary. And this is very revealing. It's a diary that covers 10 years from 1886 to 1896. And the diary is entitled The Doings and Sayings of 3 Little Boys. So when she started this diary, the boys were 4, 5, and 6 years old, and she kept the diary until they were teenagers, 14, 15, and 16 years old. She homeschooled these children, even though there was a school for boys, was not good enough for her children. So every day she had strict schooling for the boys. And also she devoted her life, her whole focus of her life basically was these 3 little boys, at least for those 10 years that we have her diary. As I said, she did not like living here. She was not very social with any of the women. The only reference that we have for her outside of her devotion to her children was to her church, which was the Episcopal Church. But her main focus was on her boys, and she was very distressed too that the local Episcopal Church did not have a full-time minister or pastor. The circuit pastor would come, and so she would write in her diary on occasion how wonderful it was to have a service at their little church because a minister had shown up to do communion. So about once a month a minister would come over from Wilmington, but that was very important to her too. So that's Maggie and the 3 boys. We'll hear a little more about them later on. But now they have faces, huh? You think? Okay, moving on to our next picture. We have the house where they lived. It may look a little familiar to you because it's still there, basically. It doesn't look quite like this anymore, but it became a hotel. When Dr. Curtis bought the house, it was basically just a house, and this is where they lived. Then he had a hotel built onto it, actually added on to the house from what we can determine. And this was from a postcard advertising the Hotel Brunswick that was owned by Dr. W.G. Curtis in Southport. So by now, if it says Southport, what time frame are we looking at? At least after 1887, because that's when we changed the name of our town from Smithville to Southport. So he had a hotel built on to the house, attached to the house. That back portion behind the tree, and by the way, that tree is still there. This is on the corner of Bay Street and Atlantic Avenue, or what was called Potts Street at that time. Then it was changed to Atlantic Avenue. And this has been operating even today, or up until a couple of years ago, at least, as a bed and breakfast, the Brunswick Inn. So this house has had quite a life. It was rebuilt from an old house that was the home of Benjamin Smith, who one of the founders of our town. In 1859, Mr. Mears tore down the old house and rebuilt it, which is basically what you see there now. Then Dr. Curtis had the hotel built onto it, as well as in the next picture, down in front of it on the waterfront, a big pavilion. This was the Curtis Pavilion, and this was a place of entertainment here in Southport at that time. Now we can say Southport. Also looked like they had a little snow, and it snows very infrequently here, and they caught a good picture of it at that time. This pavilion, it was this big building, as you can see, with lots of windows. That was a bathhouse. It was so people could change to go swimming in the rivers right on the riverfront here. It was at the foot of Atlantic Avenue. Or right in that vicinity, down on the riverfront at that point. It had rooms for receptions and also a big auditorium for dances and entertainment and all of this, those wonderful things that were going on here. In the 1880s, the late 1880s and 90s was the heyday for Smithville, or rather now, Southport, being a resort destination. So a lot of the Wilmingtonians would come here for recreation, to get away, to be down on the river, to have a good time. And that also meant there had to be places for people to stay. So therefore the hotel that had 30 to 40 rooms in it, but it was not the only hotel in town. There were several others, and boarding houses such as Kate Stewart's Stewart House boarding house, not only for entertainment and for vacationers, people who were coming here to enjoy the salubrious breezes and the wonderful ambiance of being in Southport, but also because we were the county seat for Brunswick County at this time. So there had to be places for people to stay when they came for court business. Now that picture of the gentleman down in the bottom doing all of his paperwork is not Dr. Curtis. It's another borrowed picture from some gentleman about this time who would be very involved in his business, which Dr. Curtis was, which was doctoring, which was also hoteling. Now, of course, he and Margaret and the three darling boys did not run the hotel. They would lease it out to managers or someone who would take care of it. But he was the owner and the one who was raking in the money, so to speak, hopefully. So let's look at the next photo, and we see here is the church. This is the Episcopal Church, and this family, the Curtis family, was actively involved in the church, as I was talking about a little earlier with Margaret, and also Dr. Curtis himself. He was a vestryman with the Episcopal Church here, and also went as a representative to many of the Episcopal conventions that were held here in North Carolina and other places. Also, they were very involved in fundraisers for the church, and they had the perfect place to do this down at the Pavilion. So they could have all sorts of plays and musicals and other things, dinners that would raise money for their church. Now, we know this today as the Chapel of the Cross. In fact, it was built as the Chapel of the Cross, not an Episcopal church. In 1843, before the Civil War, and it was built as a place of worship for the soldiers at Fort Johnston. And so that is the beginning of that building, or the reason that that little church is there. Then later, it was purchased or taken under the wing of the Episcopal Church, St. Philip's, and was a meeting place for St. Philip's Episcopal Church for many years, until just recently, I think probably within the last 10 years or so, did they build the new church that is just across the street going over to the right-hand side. All of you probably know where this little church is, and now it's gotten back to being called Chapel of the Cross, even though it still does belong to the Episcopalians. The big tree that you see there was the one that they cut down last year in front of the City Hall, the old City Hall or Courthouse. That brick building that you see there with no adornment to it, no porch, no columns or whatever, it was the old City Hall, for us City Hall, old courthouse, Brunswick County Courthouse, because we were the county seat for the county of Brunswick. And so many people came to town to do business here at the courthouse. The courthouse, of course, was an important part of the doctor's life, as well as the church, as well as doctoring, because he was actually appointed the clerk of court at one time. And later we'll also find out that he did become a mayor, excuse me, of Southport from 1874 to 1875, back in his earlier days. Okay, so that gives us an indication of how important politics as well as the church was to the family. Next, we're going to see a picture of the foot of Atlantic Street, where there was a city pier there, and three boys who look, oh my goodness, they look just like the Curtis boys, don't they? Out fishing, and this would have been right at the foot of their house. At the very back there is the Brunswick Inn, is the house, and so over to the left, that open space is Atlantic Street, or at that time Potts Street. So if you went downtown today, you would drive down Atlantic Street. You would be right at this very spot. The building that you see closest to the water there on the front, the dark colored building, is or was the quarantine hospital. And Dr. Curtis, of course, was the quarantine physician here for 30 years. And this building is the old quarantine office that was there, not so much as a hospital, even though they did bring sick people there occasionally, but in later years, it was more of the administrative office for the big quarantine station that we'll see a picture of in just a few minutes. Back behind the dark building, way up in the upper right-hand corner, is the Frink house, and that was another doctor here in town, the Dr. Frink. And if you go now downtown to the corner of Bay and Atlantic, and you see the Brunswick Inn sitting up there, the big nice white house, then next to it you're going to see a little brick bungalow sort of place, and the next house over is the Frink house, and the Pravats have that house now. And sadly, Mrs. Pratt, the widow of the lawyer Pratt, died this past weekend. Okay, let's look at the next photo. And we're going to see the Garrison. The Garrison, of course, was at Fort Johnston. And these photos are from about 1900. Dr. Curtis is still living. The boys are still thriving. And we get an idea of what the Garrison lawn looked like then, with the big water tank and also other buildings that were around on it. I think that this picture on the left-hand side was referenced as being around the 4th of July in 1900, around that time. The other picture that you see there, I wanted to show you this one because it gives you another perception of what the Garrison looked like from the river, if you were on a boat taking a picture of it looking up there. And you see there's a windmill, there's the water tower, basically the same thing that you're looking at in the little picture up there on the left. But you can see the church outline is white with the black outlines, and that's the Episcopal Church we just saw a few minutes earlier. And how sparse it looks there, because there were no houses, no buildings up against the Garrison like we see today that have been added as the years have gone by. We don't see the city hall or the courthouse because it's directly behind the Garrison building there, so it's not visible, but of course it's right next to the church, as it has been since 1850s. And someone had written on the postcard, "How would you like to be here?" Well, yeah, we can be there this afternoon if we want to. So it's still wonderful to live in this place. But this is what the Curtis family would have looked at, where the boys may have run around and played because they lived nearby, right there on the same street. Next, we're going to see the Wilmington steamship. This was the way they got back and forth to Wilmington. If you wanted to go anywhere at all, you basically had to go to Wilmington first to get there, as far as going on the train. And there were no roads that cars or trains coming down here to Smithville, Southport at this time. The Wilmington steamboat there was put on the water in April of 1891, and that it was new. And that's when the first trip between Wilmington and Southport was made by this steamship. But there were many, many steamships that came up and down the Cape Fear River at this time, because between Wilmington and Charleston especially, and then on down to Savannah, was a very heavily trafficked route for moving things up and down the East Coast. And Smithville, Southport was one of the stops that these steamboats always made. This is what made Kate Stewart and her Stewart boarding house so famous. This is what brought money into the pocket of Dr. Curtis, along with other people who were running hotels and boarding houses at this time as well. So the Wilmington and other steamboats were very popular. The picture at the bottom is the dock. This is where people waited for the boat to come to dock there so that they could get on and off and go on their way. In the back, you can again see closest to the left-hand side, the dark building, that was the quarantine office. And then the White House that's in the middle is another view of the Frink house, Dr. Frink's house up on Bay Street across from the water. And then the big house with the wraparound porch there on the far right-hand side is Kate Stewart's Stewart house. And she also had a dock that went out from her house. So many times some of these steamships would stop there. Guess what? Dr. Curtis was also involved in the business of steamshipping. And so he had made some investments on some of these steamships that were going up and down the river at that time. So he had his finger in many pies, as well as his doctoring and quarantine responsibilities. Next, we're going to see a little delightful thing that happened to him. In 1856, 50 years after he, 1896, excuse me, 50 years after he had been in the class of 1846 at Dartmouth College, they awarded him an honorary degree. So even though he only got through 3 terms, 50 years later, he did get his BA degree from Dartmouth as an honorary degree. So that was a nice thing to happen to him at that time. A really good time. Next, we're going to see Margaret took Clarence and Cortland on a train to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Couple of other borrowed pictures of train travel at that time, with a little boy looking out the window as they traveled along. And one of the diary entries that we have from Margaret at this time talks about their trip going up to Chicago. And she says here that on August the 20th, 1893, we started from Wilmington this morning at 9:30 on the Atlantic Coastline Railroad for the World's Fair. Julia and Walter Daggett went with us, and our party consisted of the 2 Daggetts, Clarence, Cortland, and myself. We felt dreadfully to leave dear little Howard, but we concluded that it was too hard a trip for him, and dear Papa, of course, could not leave. So Howard was left behind. He was about 10 years old at this time, but his 2 older brothers, who were 12 and 14, went with their mother, Margaret, and this other couple from here in town up to Chicago by train. And she talks a little bit about the train travel, and they had to make several changes of trains in Wilmington, and then up in Chesapeake, and then Cincinnati. But anyway, on this morning, we awoke this morning to find ourselves rather tired, but the magnificent scenery, the grand Allegheny Mountains loomed up in all its grandeur. And we had a very nice breakfast in the cars. At 10 o'clock, we arrived at White Sulphur Springs, Virginia. Oh, the mountains, how I feast my eyes upon them, and what longing I have had for them for years. All day the scenery has been grand, and we are having such a wonderful time. And then they arrived, of course, in Chicago, and she says of that, oh, the grand sight. I wish dear Papa and our dear boy Howard was with us. Then our happiness would be full. It is out of the question to describe the fair. It is impossible without seeing it, and almost beyond comprehension after even going through it. It's grand, magnificent, marvelous are trifling terms to express your feelings when standing in these gardens and palaces. It's the wildest dream of Aladdin, like creation, and whose architect and greatness serves to cover all of this wonderfulness here. It cannot be appreciated without being seen. So this was quite a grand thing to happen for the family here, especially for these little fellas who were seeing Chicago and the greatness of the World's Fair there. Now, what was going on back home was not all that good, because Dr. Curtis was in the middle of losing his job as a quarantine doctor. And also there was a very, very bad storm, and during this time, we were talking about August, like a hurricane, I guess. And many of the people here in town had to run to the Brunswick Hotel, the biggest place in town, for refuge. And this was a report that Margaret had written about in the diary, and when she was saying, we're having a wonderful time, but things are not so great back home. So there was always something to contend with here in town. So as we look at our next picture here, we're going to see the quarantine station. Now, actually, I mentioned that Dr. Curtis was losing his job, and he had been doing quarantine work here for about 30 years by now. And the quarantine station was becoming a bigger and bigger and more major operation. And by 1897, this little village was actually built out in the river. And today we can see one small concrete platform left, if you've ever noticed that, down or actually upriver going toward Wilmington. But that one little platform is the platform that water tower stood on at that time. And that's all that's left of this quarantine station that was out in the middle of the river. Between the years of 1897 was when they finally started constructing it and using it until 1937. And it had 10 buildings on it at one time. There was a laundry. There was, of course, the quarantine hospital or rooms where they could take sick people. Why did we need a quarantine station? Because every ship that came into Wilmington, as is now, has to come through Southport. And at that time, they had to stop here and be examined. The ships had to be inspected to be sure that there was no disease or anything that could spread all over the city, like it did back in 1862 when we had the yellow fever, and other times as well. So the quarantine station was an important part of the economy, or not really the economy, but actually what Southport was about for these years. And it was run by the Department of Marine Health. So therefore it was no longer, the quarantine physician was no longer an appointment by the state governor, which is how Dr. Curtis had kept that job for those 30 years. He kept being appointed over and over again by the governor of North Carolina because it was a state job. But now it had gone over to the U.S. Marine Hospital Service. And so the feds took it over, and it became even larger and more viable. We'll have to do a whole program sometime on the Cape Fear quarantine station, because it's quite interesting, and how many people lived out there and worked out there, and all of the things that went on. But moving on, we now are going to see a picture, the black and white picture of the Curtis home that they had built over on Moore Street. So this was after they had moved out of the hotel building, the house there that had the hotel attached to it. And Dr. Curtis had this house built for his family on Moore Street. This was around the turn of the century, around 1900. And today, you see the color picture there. This is the house that sits on the same lot. And this is directly across the street from the back of the community building where the tennis courts are. So that nice, beautiful house that sits there now is in the same spot as where Dr. and Mrs. Curtis and for a little while the boys were there before they left home. So you can get an idea of where they were living. The tree in front of the black and white picture is the same tree that you see there on the left-hand side of the house. So it's still there. So we know these trees last a long time, our wonderful live oaks. Moving on now, we're about to finish up here. I want to tell you a little bit about what happened to the boys. Walter Clarence Curtis, he was the oldest of those three boys, born in 1879. We don't know much about what was going on in his life after his teenage years when his mother stopped writing the diary. By the way, that diary is available for you to go on and read word for word if you like at the Southport Historical Society.org, and go to the Susie Carson Research Room and look up Margaret Curtis diaries, and it's all right there. And if you want some interesting reading about what was going on, especially with Maggie and the boys during those 10 years, you can read it all right there. So after they grew up here, he attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He became an auditor at the Southern National Bank over in Wilmington. And that's the last we heard of Clarence, which was kind of amazing. I looked and looked and looked for Clarence. Did find out that he moved to New Jersey and that he married Frances Nicholson Christie, and that he was the father of 3 children. This was in death notice that I was able to find from Find a Grave. And that he died in Ocean Grove, New Jersey, December 25th, 1868. And he was 89 years old. So he did have a good long life. The tombstone that we have for him is also combined with that of his wife. And she was born in France, by the way, which I thought was very interesting. Would have loved to have found out more about that meeting and love story. But anyway, she died several years before him. And anyway, they're both buried there in, I think in New York is actually where the burial place is, even though he died in New Jersey, evidently living in Ocean Grove when he died. So that's the tombstone that we have for Walter Clarence Curtis and his wife, Frances Nicholson. Next, we have the information about Nathanael. He was the second of these 3 sons. Found a picture of him. That's actually him. I didn't borrow him from anybody. And that was his obituary picture. He was the most successful of the 3 sons. He graduated from Chapel Hill in 1900. He also went to Columbia University in New York City and studied there until 1902. He married Elizabeth Thatch in 1913. He also had 3 children, and he was the first dean of Tulane University's School of Architecture. He died in 1953 in New Orleans, and he had a very successful life as a professor at Tulane, and also as an architect. His burial site is there. You see where he's buried in New Orleans, and the marker for his grave. But another success story is Nathanael Cortland Curtis Jr., who was the grandson now of Dr. Curtis. This is the son of Nathanael. So you can see his picture. He looks a lot like his father. And he was born in 1917, died in 1997. He was an artist and an architect, and he is most known for his contribution to being one of the lead architects on the design and the building of the New Orleans Superdome. And that opened up was being built between the years of 1971 and 75. If you've ever been to the Superdome, then you have been to a place that has a connection with Smithville and Southport, North Carolina. The grandson of Dr. Walter G. Curtis was one of the leaders in organizing, designing, and building the Superdome. And I thought that was quite remarkable. So we have gone definitely beyond our little town with these two fellas. And then our third son, Howard Coit Curtis, and yep, down at the bottom. Howard was the third of the three sons born in 1882, but he never married and he had no children. Howard kind of did a little of this and a little of that. He was a publisher of the Southport Herald, decided he had put together a newspaper, which he actually owned from 1905 to 1909. He only was active in publishing the paper for 1 year in 1905, and then he kind of gave up on that, let somebody else do the publishing, but he's maintained the ownership for another few years. He also started the Southport Ice Manufacturing Company, which I guess was something that was much needed, and he was appointed the postmaster of Southport in May of 1913. However, he died a year later, a little over a year later, in November of 1914 at age 32. And he had a heart condition as a result, so basically died of a heart attack. And he's buried over in Oakdale Cemetery along with both his parents. They have a plot and one stone there, and Howard is part of that one. And you'll hear a little more about that in a minute. So as we move on, that takes care of the boys. What happened to them? Well, what happened to Dr. Curtis? He died. And he died in Southport here on August the 9th, 1909. He had been in failing health for about 10 years before he died. About the time he lost his job as a quarantine doctor, he began to go downhill. And he is also interred in Oakdale Cemetery in Wilmington. And at the time he died, he was survived by his wife, Margaret, and the three sons. Why do you think Dr. Curtis, our wonderful doctor who had been here for 62 years, was buried in Oakdale Cemetery? Because Margaret hated Southport. And Margaret was not going to have her distinguished doctor husband buried in this silly old plot out here next to two ex-wives, which we never hear anything else about, and Nathanael, his father. So she just had him packed up and taken over to Oakdale. And that's where he was buried. But not only him, let's move along next. An important thing happened right after he died. 2 years after Dr. Curtis died, in 1911, the railroad finally came to town. This was another very important thing that he was involved in for many years. In fact, he rented out the pavilion many times for railroad meetings when the moguls would come from all over the country trying to determine whether or not they should put a train coming into Southport or not. And that's a whole nother program about the trains and all of that. But I will say that the railroad finally got here, but it was too late for Dr. Curtis to enjoy the fruit of all the work that he had put in for many years and all the meetings he had to try to get this spur of the train brought in from Wilmington. This is the opening day. This is the day they celebrated the train being here. The big trees that you see over behind the train in the left-hand side are in the cemetery. The train track came right down Rhett Street next to the cemetery. That's down to the waterfront. So that's where the train station was, which you see in the next picture up at the top. the station, of course, actually built there, and the train came along the side there. You can see the trees over in the background that are in the cemetery there. And we had a band. Southport had a band at that time, and they performed quite a bit around town. And of course, they were out for the big celebration that finally we had trains. So didn't have to take the steamships up to Wilmington anymore. You could jump on the train here. It came twice a day in the morning and afternoon, and picked up people and left them off. And so back and forth they went. Now, as we close it out, we're going to see next that, of course, Margaret lasted a little while longer. Dr. Curtis had died in 1909, so she did not die until 1923. And guess what? She stayed in Southport even after Dr. Curtis died. She didn't get up and go to Wilmington, where it was much more cosmopolitan than it was in the backwaters here. But she did stay on here, and she died at 80 years of age. But the funeral was held in Wilmington at the Episcopal Church there, and the interim was at Oakdale, where he, her husband, and her son Howard, who had died in 1914, were buried. So the one stone covers all three of them there, for Dr. Curtis, for Margaret, and also for Howard. So if we go over to Wilmington to the Oakdale Cemetery, we can see them. And now I'd like to close this by reading to you on the next picture here some comments from a very wonderful 3-column, very extensive obituary that was written about him from a friend in the Wilmington paper. And he did have a life well lived. His strong personality made loyal friendships, and none knew him who did not respect and love him for his integrity, his convictions and conduct, his high principles, his public spirit, his devotion to his family as husband and father. His loyalty to his friends marked him as a man to be trusted and loved, one who would be faithful to any test. His home was always open to his friends, was the house that entertained with old-time hospitality to all prominent visitors, political, military, and clerical. What more ideal life than his? A cultured gentleman of the old school, dwelling his life in a beautiful but secluded part of the world. Truly, a landmark has fallen. Who can fill his place? And so that we can still think about Dr. Curtis as that. And I'd like to say, as a Southerner, and saying goodbye to you today, that it only took 60 plus years to turn this New England boy into a fine Southern gentleman. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Quite a trip you took us through the Victorian area.
Yeah.
The Curtis family.
Good.
And I'm going to have to erase all those copies I made of Margaret and the boys.
Oh, okay.
I was ready to put them out immediately.
Okay. Well,
those were great borrowed pictures. They really, I mean, I believed it until you said they weren't, but they really have some ambiance to it.
well, you know, Bob, we could always hope nobody's ever going to look at that would know who they were anyway. So whatever.
Pat, I have a question about the first two wives.
Uh-huh.
As I recall, I haven't been in the cemetery in a while, but their tombstones face each other, right? One faces this way.
Well, yeah, one got turned around in the opposite direction from the father and the first wife, and then Sarah Twining, the second wife, hers is turned in another direction. Well, the ghost story is that there was a big row in the cemetery one night between the two Sarahs. And one of them knocked the other one down and got confused and turned around.
Okay, so we just think the tombstone is the other way. She's not buried.
Actually, the tombstone for Sarah Twining's second wife was mended at one time. It had broken completely off. And when it was put back together, whoever did it, yay, those many years ago, wasn't paying attention to which direction it should be going in. So that's why it's backwards.
Interesting.
Hey, Bill and Sandy.
Hi.
Being,
So anyway,
being from New England, if you want to know, it's called Hopkinton.
I cannot say that, Bill. I have a hard
I
time.
think that it's the first syllable is that when you accent, it's Hopkinton.
Okay,
Say it really
good.
fast, Hopkinton.
That's what I can't do, honey. I'm from the South, and I can't say much of anything real fast. Thanks for all of your attention today. I know I go on and on, but that's what you get when you get Pat Kirkman.
Excellent, Pat. Excellent.
It was excellent.
Yep.
Thank you. Have a good day. Stay strong. Stay well.
Oh, I just want to mention tomorrow in the coloring club, we will be talking about the Brunswick Inn. So you'll learn more
Good, good.
about it, and we'll get to color it. And if all goes well, Stewart Kalari, who used to live there, will be joining us and talking about it. So
Perfect. Good, good. Stewart's very interesting. Yeah.
all right. Bye-bye, everybody.